Let me start with a broad brushstroke first, before going into the nitty-gritty of this YouTube episode. Kevork Oskanyan, a lecturer in political science and international studies at the University of Birmingham, posted a number of tweets when the war ended in the Southern Caucasus. I'd like to highlight only 2 points he made inter alia, and I paraphrase them here for you. Kevork Oskanyan opined that Armenians have difficult choices to make in the coming days, weeks, and months, choices that will possibly strike at the core of our national identity, between the nationalists of the past, with objectives born from past grievance and injustice, and more forward-looking notions of citizenship geared towards securing statehood itself within the realities of the 21st century South Caucasus. He then also made another point where he says that which of these two choices emerges dominant after what will be probably a period of political turmoil depends on how the defeat in Nagorno-Karabakh ends up being interpreted as a failure of the traditional nationalism dominant in the country since 1988, or as a stab in the back by an elite insufficiently committed to the cause. For Armenia, this is a fork in the road which may end up shaping internal as well as external politics for generations. So welcome to Nagorno-Karabakh number 8, where I very briefly discuss today the mechanics of the ceasefire or truce for a conflict that started on the 27th of September and ended on the 9th of November with a 9-point, short and rather vague document that consolidated, alas, an Armenian defeat. But let me preface this by encouraging viewers to check my description box, where I'm sharing with you what I deem are valuable links on this broad conflict. Namely, I'll put a link for another source where you can make donations if you want to help the servicemen of this war. The majority of the funds and donations being collected are going to the All Armenia Hayastan Fund, or the Himna Dram, which is a wonderful fund or foundation with integrity. But I would like to share this link with you as well, which is specific for the servicemen of the war. I would also like to share with you another link from Eric Hakopian, an analyst who talks about Armenia's internal and external relations on CivilNet TV. Then, a piece on Christianity in Karabakh and how Azerbaijan has tried to rewrite history by Dr. Hrach Chilingirian. Another link will be one for an article written by Stepan Altunian in Asbarez about the need of Armenia as a nation to have a comprehensive defense plan. And last but not least, an interview, and here roles are reversed because Eric Hakopian, the guest, now becomes the interviewer or presenter, with Zareh Sinanyan, who is the High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs in the current Armenian government, in which they discuss today and tomorrow post the defeat in Nagorno-Karabakh. Okay, let's get down to brass tacks. And in doing that, I also want to rely somewhat on an organization that I value a lot and that deals with deadly conflicts, namely Crisis Group, and specifically their senior analyst for the Caucasus, Olesya Vartanyan, whose expertise is often grist to my own mill. But let me first, before I come out with those few points that I want to make, let me also highlight two things that have, since my #1 until this YouTube episode #8, have dictated my thinking. I'm adding those two because I've seen documents and statements that have come out by different Armenian organizations. I've listened to pieces on the radio with Armenians talking about the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. And having listened and read such output, I want to make my position clear. First, I do not think that the conflict over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenians is a religious conflict. It's not a war between Christianity and Islam, whether Shia Islam, to which the majority of Azerbaijan belongs, or Christianity, and Armenians have been the first nation state in history to adopt Christianity. These are facts, but in my humble opinion, they do not dictate this conflict. And the second thing I would like to say is that I do not subscribe to the opinion that we should heap all the responsibility of this defeat on the current government in Armenia, on Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his ministers, or even necessarily on President Armen Sarkisyan, but we should remember that this conflict dates some 3 decades, and therefore all of them from 1990s onward until 2020 share responsibility. And I have articulated my thoughts on what responsibility lies with the current leadership in previous episodes of my Nagorno-Karabakh musings or observations or analyses. But let me come back to this 9-point truce, this document. There is a lack of clarity there. So what are the teeth of this agreement, and what about its implementation? Let me moot just a few issues, small and not so small, and then leave you, policymakers, thinkers, practitioners, activists on the ground, with questions that perhaps you too would consider require answers. My first point is, this is an agreement that has been drawn up and signed between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. We saw the Russian and Azeri presidents signing it on the telly. The Armenian prime minister preferred not to be seen in public signing the document. Fine, but this is a trilateral agreement. Is it going to remain a trilateral agreement? And what would be its survival chances or rates if it is not also endorsed by the United Nations, by the United Nations Security Council, for instance? Shouldn't that be happened in order to clothe this agreement with international legitimacy, if we are going to stick by it? The second point I would make is, what will be the role of the OSCE Minsk group? There is a lot of talk about the Minsk group, who is in and who's out. Okay, the 3 co-chairs are Russia, France, and the United States. Russia woke up after a few weeks of the conflict and produced this document, and in some way pressured Azerbaijan and Armenia and convinced Turkey to agree to its 9 clauses. But what about France and the United States? What about the other states that are not co-chairs, but that have been part of the OSCE process? After all, there are 11 such states. Where does the Minsk group go with this? The French Senate recently recognized the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh with its Armenian name Artsakh. But that was only some sort of a gesture, a political gesture to the Armenian community, which is quite large in France. But what about the legal role and the political role that the OSCE Minsk group would undertake? It's not clear to my mind. The third point, and this is something that the senior analyst from Crisis Group also mentioned, we have been talking about the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh in terms of self-determination versus secession. And we have used other examples. I discussed this with my guest, Dr. Ibrahim Freyhat, also in one of our YouTube episodes. He, as you know by now, hopefully, is one of the scholars on conflict resolution. We discussed also, and I mentioned South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But what about international engagements other than the Russian deployment? At the moment, all I hear is that the Russians will deploy monitors to try and safeguard this agreement, with Turkey probably restraining itself to the center that monitors via drones and satellite the implementation of this agreement. But what about others? What about the United Nations? Shouldn't the UN also be part of this agreement? Hence my first query to you about some sort of an endorsement by the UN Security Council. And talking about South Ossetia and Abkhazia, can we learn lessons from Donbass or Donetsk, which is a de facto republic these days, or claims to be one, the standoff between Eastern Ukraine and Russia, or the Transnistria between Russia and Moldova? These are international law cases that could have persuasive authority, as we would say in law, toward finding a resolution to Nagorno-Karabakh. Smaller but important points. This is an agreement that is vague. It is inevitable that there will be disagreements. Those disagreements could be minor, they could become major. So will there be monthly meetings or any sort of meetings between the two sides, the Armenian side and the Azerbaijani side, in order to iron out those inevitable problems? After all, the Armenians are supposed to people Stepanakert and some other areas of the enclave, whereas Azerbaijan will be in control of Shusha, as Azeris call it, Armenians call it Shushi, and other areas as well, including all the 7 areas surrounding the enclave that had been occupied by Armenia, but have now been retrieved by Azerbaijan. Is there a committee? Is there any kind of a procedure whereby people would meet in order to discuss those issues? For instance, I talked about Stepanakert, I talked about Shusha. Water that flows to Stepanakert comes from Shusha or Shushi. Who's going to control that if there are problems? What if somebody closes that water at its source? What about if there are issues with the water reaching Stepanakert? These are teething problems perhaps, but they could inflate themselves into major problems. And I believe that there should be some serious thought given to how this is resolved. So, from Kevorko Skanyan to the links that I'm actually posting in the description box, quite a few links with a rich selection of viewpoints and information, to the fact that I do not agree that this has any religious resonance. Yes, I'm aware of the religious sides. I've spoken about them in another one of my Nagorno-Karabakh episodes as well. So I'm not trying to avoid the question or the issue. What I'm saying is that that is one of the factors in this conflict, but that the conflict is not one of Christianity versus Islam. It's not a religious conflict. I've seen this happen across the world, from Northern Ireland to elsewhere, where people have tried to brace themselves for a war between different Christian traditions and communities, between different faiths. I don't think this is it. I also do not believe that the, how should I put it, the responsibility, the accountability lies strictly and only with the current government. Then, of course, I gave you some examples, some questions which require answers. Some of the questions are huge, are big. When we're talking about UNSC endorsement, when we're talking about OSCE process, when we're talking about the different cases from South Ossetia and Abkhazia all the way to Donbass and Transnistria, these are big issues, but there are small issues. And the small issues sometimes are far more important than the big issues, such as water, such as electricity, such as daily lives, such as having neighbors who can't bear to see each other. Those are issues that need to be dealt with. And in the past, I've concluded on my Nagorno-Karabakh side of YouTube episodes, I've often concluded with a philosopher here or a philosopher there, like Aristotle, like Plato. Today, I would like to conclude with Baruch Spinoza. He was a Dutch philosopher of Portuguese Sephardi origins, and he is considered one of the early thinkers of the Enlightenment. He also came to be considered as one of the great nationalists of 17th century philosophy. And why do I bring him up at the conclusion of this YouTube episode today? Because he reminded us that peace is not merely the absence of war. I agree with that statement, and I wish you a good week ahead. Take care.